Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It's a real pleasure. It's always fun for me, frankly, to be back in Brussels, on a continent where I've spent 8 years of my life. See some old friends, even some people I wasn't expecting to see, seeing Carl Kovanda, who now is doing a variety of other things, but had important positions here at a European level, was the Czech ambassador to the United Nations. I was reminding him that by great coincidence, it was 25 years ago yesterday that he and I were working in Prague on a day when the Czech government was considering some of the first technology issues that governments in Central and Eastern Europe were considering. And then it was on that night that the US and the UK basically took a step in the first Gulf War, and bombs started falling in Baghdad. And after a long day of meeting and serving as a translator, he spent the entire night translating to the people of Czechoslovakia CNN into Czech so the people could understand what was happening. And in a way, I think that's an interesting thing to remark upon, because it's a reminder of the tumultuous times that all of us have lived through around the world over the last quarter of a century, and that's not a bad thing to think about as we think about the events before us today. A lot has changed, but we're living in another tumultuous time. And I entitled my talk today, Too Important to Fail. Whether we're talking about the safe harbor negotiation or the broader work that is being done around the protection of personal privacy and public safety, this work and these discussions are simply too important to fail. I might start by hearkening back to the words penned so famously by another person who lived in what is now the European Union, Charles Dickens. In 1859, he started his famous book with the famous sentences, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Those were tumultuous times. They were tumultuous times characterized by a great transition in terms of an industrial revolution, advances in technology, economic integration, and many things both good and bad. And I think it's worth reflecting on the way that speaks to our events today. Certainly when we think about the best of times, I will say that those of us in the tech sector think in part about the evolution of cloud computing and what it offers to people here in Europe and around the world. You see it in all kinds of things that our customers are doing. You see it in what a company like ThyssenKrupp is doing to use machine learning and the cloud so that in office buildings, it is easier to know where elevators should be and people spend less time waiting for them. You see them in the work of a company like Temenos, which is developing banking that is accessible to millions of people in Africa who need the benefits of microfinancing. You see it, frankly, in the cafeterias in Redmond, Washington at Microsoft, where we're using sensors, part of the Internet of Things, connected together with the cloud to enable the efficient growing vertically indoors of produce. In effect, urban farming that uses 90% less water than produce that is grown in soil. You see it in ways that are small, and you see it in ways that are profound, that can make such a difference in people's lives. I'm captivated, for example, by the story of a Swedish company, Optolexia, and what they're doing with relatively simple hardware, backed by the resources in our data center of the cloud, to help young people who are having a difficult time reading. And they're able to determine who has dyslexia and who therefore can be helped with it, as you see in this very short video.
Mamma säger, nu ska vi ge oss iväg. Pappa säger, aj, mitt huvud.
If you have undiagnosed dyslexia today, this is going to affect your whole life. Not only is your reading skill poor, but it also affects your confidence and your motivation in school.
Our vision is that every pupil should have the right kind of support in school as early as possible.
Screening methods today do not measure reading performance at all.
The Optolexia screening tool is based on actual reading. So what we do is let the children read a short passage of text, and we record the eye movements using an eye tracker. We have been using Visual Studio to develop the client for recording eye movements. These eye movements recordings are sent to the cloud and are processed using machine learning models to look for patterns that differentiate a normal reader from a dyslexic reader.
The customer needs to trust us that this is a secure solution. This is sensitive data.
Microsoft has helped us to take our method from being a research product to something that we can actually do live in school. And here we have the possibility to help children become better readers and to improve their lives.
I think that does speak to some of the best of times that we have. And it speaks to the fact that while the cloud is about technology, more fundamentally than that, it is about what technology can do for people. It is something that can transform the work of governments and enterprises and NGOs, and it can play such an important role in the decade and decades ahead in addressing fundamental human needs. And yet you also see how it is completely dependent on data, often personally sensitive data, to accomplish all of that. But of course, that's not the only thing that's going on in the world. We really do live in a time that has the best of times and the worst of times some days. You see it in the events of our time. You see it in the tumultuous circumstances in which we live, and you see it in specific days, like the 13th of November last year, an evening that started in Paris, the same way a great many Friday evenings start in Paris, as I well remember, having lived there for 3 years. It was an evening where in a cafe on the Boulevard Voltaire at 9:30, an individual walked in, sat down at the counter, calmly ordered a meal, and 9 minutes later blew himself up. And suddenly the streets of Paris were filled not just with people starting their weekend, but with the sound of sirens and the sights of cars that next weekend on the Boulevard Voltaire, we saw this image instead. And we live in a time that just a couple of weeks later, on the other side of the Atlantic, we saw in San Bernardino, California, these sights and these same types of images honoring 14 people who had been killed. And we might all quite rightly ask, well, what do these events have to do with technology? What do these events have to do with us here today? Well, the answer is apparent in some of the news stories that followed. Readily, people asked whether these attacks in Paris and California meant that surveillance needed to be talked about again, whether encrypted communications had been used, whether the pendulum needed to move back in terms of the balance that needs to be struck between public safety and privacy. And as we think about those questions, and we think about the answers that people in government need to focus on behalf of all of us, I think it helps to reflect a little bit about why are these issues arising? Why are these debates about encryption and surveillance and privacy so pitched today? Why this? Why now? Well, I think part of the answer comes in the role of the internet today. When the internet was first invented and discussed broadly, it was regarded as a different domain, cyberspace, as if it was disconnected from physical space and the real world. And yet what we see today is the internet is where people go when they want to shape what happens in the real world, for good or for bad. We also recognize that the internet has made the world smaller. In some ways, it has almost made real the image that humanity first had of itself in 1968 when human beings first orbited the moon and saw our planet from afar. There are no borders in space, but actually here on Earth, borders still matter. And whether we're talking about the Sony attack or other issues, it turns out that here on Earth, there is no national security without cybersecurity. And that, in part, explains why these issues are so important. And yet, if that were the only issue that mattered, this pendulum would probably be swinging quite widely, and yet it hasn't swung nearly as much as some might have expected a year ago or a month ago. And the answer, in part, is because something else matters and has been at issue as well, and that's trust. Trust in the internet, trust in technology, and trust in the protection of people's information. We live in a different world with people asking different questions about trust, and there are reasons for that as well. Some of them have to do with this person who's become a face that is recognized literally around the world. Edward Snowden changed the world when he took 4 laptops and got on an airplane and began to inform the world about new things that were going on. And one sees these important and legitimate questions about trust raised by a variety of people in a variety of settings. One sees them reflected in the decision in Luxembourg by the European Court. One hears them in the words of the individual who brought that case and what he had to say about it.
What is it that you're afraid these companies are doing with your data?
We have the basic problem that we have the mass surveillance scandal and we didn't really have any consequences in Europe. There were like angry letters by politicians, but nothing really happened. And the idea was really to go after the companies because we, as Europe, we don't have any jurisdiction over what the US is doing on the internet on mass surveillance. But they need these companies to help them to get all this data. And the idea was to go after the companies because, for example, Facebook, the one that was in this case, is operating 82% of their worldwide user base out of Dublin, which falls under European jurisdiction. There you can actually say, if you aid foreign spy agencies, that very likely conflicts with European fundamental rights, and that was pretty much the case that was brought.
In a way, that raises for all of us who work in the technology sector a very fundamental question. What's to be done? If we want to provide technology that is going to serve the world, we need to earn the world's trust. We need to ensure that people who use the cloud have confidence in it. And we need to do so amidst pretty stormy seas. And we need to figure out how to navigate these waters. I think in the first instance, this really calls on all of us to define a principled approach and a principled path forward. And that starts by recognizing in part that this is a difficult and complicated issue in part because there are multiple values that are important and they are sometimes in tension with each other. Not always, but sometimes. We need, of course, to live in a world where the public is safe, and we want to live in a world where people's privacy and freedom of expression is protected. We need to do both of these things. We need to live in a peaceful world that requires respect for national sovereignty and each other's borders, but we also want to live in a world where markets are open and the internet creates a genuinely global network. We need to hold those values in balance as well. If we're going to find our way forward, it is helpful, we believe, that we can look to a few guiding North Stars. One of them is that we need an internet that is governed by law. When cyberspace was first discussed, people talked about it almost from a utopian perspective and from a sense that it would be better if there were no law. But what we've come to appreciate is that there needs to be law that governs the internet, but it needs to be good law. But second, it needs to be a law in which elected governments strike the balance between these various principles. Sometimes people come to those of us who work in the tech sector, and I always feel the same way. I said, look, nobody elected us. These are fundamental democratic principles and values, and these balances need to be struck by the people who are elected by the population to represent them. And we will have a point of view. We want to share it. We will comply with the laws when they are passed. But fundamentally, we need to look to government to continue to play the important role that it does. But as we do so, I believe there is one other principle that can help achieve this balance and sometimes break through the clutter, and that is the power of transparency. The more we can ensure that the public knows how data are being used, the more we can take concrete steps that will help people have the trust and confidence that they deserve. Now, the fact that governments need to set the rules and play this vital role doesn't mean that companies don't have important work to do. I fully recognize that. Certainly, we at Microsoft think about the role that we want to play as a company. It fundamentally starts with a sentence that Satya Nadella, our CEO, shared in a strategy memo with our employees about 18 months ago. And fundamentally, what Satya said was this: technology needs to advance, but timeless values need to endure. And certainly for us, we have thought a lot about how to crystallize the values that we want to advance. We've done this by formulating 4 principles that Satya shared when he spoke to a group of government leaders in Washington, D.C. late last year, when he had this to say.
Trust for us is central to our mission of empowering every person and organization. And we're taking a principled approach with strong commitments to make sure that our customers can trust digital technology that they use. We have 4 pillars to this. When it comes to privacy, we will ensure your data is private and is under your control. When it comes to compliance, we will manage your data in accordance with the law of the land. We will also be transparent about both the collection of data and the uses of data. And lastly, we will ensure that all your data is secure. These are the 4 strong commitments that we will make in everything we do, all our products, all of our services, how we work with our customers both proactively and reactively. It's grounded in these 4 principles.
Those 4 principles and these 5 words that you see on this slide, trust, security, privacy, transparency, and compliance, are topics that we have spent enormous time on. And we're now using them to guide every decision we make when it comes to how we architect our cloud services, how and where we invest, and how we work with customers. And what we've recognized is we need to back these commitments with technology. We have sought to do that. We've sought to take new steps to advance security by bringing together people who are monitoring our networks and sharing information with customers. We've sought to do that with an unprecedented investment in data centers around the world. Over 100 data centers in over 40 countries that we operate as 24 different regions. We've sought to do that with new data centers here across Europe. Just late last year, announcing data center investments not only in the United Kingdom, but in Germany, where we created not just a commitment to build more data centers, but to offer to customers across Europe in enterprise accounts, governments and businesses and NGOs, a new model in which a subsidiary of Deutsche Telekom would be a data trustee, and Microsoft employees would have no access to the data itself. It was a fascinating week when these were announced because, as you would expect, the UK announcement was national news in the UK. But this new model was actually news around the world. When people woke up the next morning in Asia and turned on CNBC News in Singapore, this is what they saw.
Microsoft threw the tech industry a curveball overnight, announcing a German data plan to tackle U.S. internet spying. Let's bring in Akiko, who's been poring over the details of this one. Akiko, I gotta think that the reason that they would set up data centers in Germany, and I'm sure Germany likes the idea because at one point America was hacking Angela Merkel's phone, and she was really upset about that. This is sort of a reaction to Ed Snowden, isn't it? I mean, to keep it away from the paws of the American NSA and those people?
Yeah, absolutely, Bernie. You know, American companies have really struggled to regain the trust of its customers abroad in the wake of that disclosure from Edward Snowden on NSA surveillance. And this agreement from Microsoft certainly could have sweeping implications for the tech industry.
As you can see, there's been no shortage of public discussion. It's been an interesting phenomenon to be a part of, because we found ourselves having to really get out and explain both what we're trying to accomplish and why, and also what we're not necessarily trying to accomplish, as you see in this next short news clip.
So let me be blunt. By doing this, whatever sort of may be the philosophical view in the grander scheme of things, but it does deny the US the ability for surveillance of that data.
Well, actually, what this does is give Europeans the confidence that if they choose this option, their rights will be protected by European law. Things will have to go before a German government or court, and the United States government can continue to work in a lawful way by interacting with other governments, in this case, the German government. But it will be done pursuant to the international rule of law. Is indeed the fundamental message that we are working to advance. We need a world in which people know that their rights will be protected by both their domestic and international law. And as the cloud moves around the world, we need to ensure that the law moves with it. This is a time for action to make that vision of the future real. And if we're going to succeed, I believe we'll need to focus on three fundamental issues and opportunities in the year 2016. The first is a new safe harbor agreement. As we think about these negotiations and the evolution of this issue, we believe that this is an issue that is too important to fail. Now, we recognize that negotiations don't always succeed by a particular deadline, or they may not come to a fruition in every which way possible. But as we've also learned over time, even on days when one doesn't completely succeed, it doesn't mean that one needs to accept failure. We will need to press ahead across the Atlantic, in Europe, and around the world, both with respect to the Safe Harbor Agreement itself and these issues more broadly. This is a year when we're seeing a bigger and bigger debate about surveillance, and that's appropriate. It is an agreement that needs to take stock of both public safety and personal privacy. But if we're going to succeed, we believe that one must start where Commissioner Jourova began. We must start by respecting the fact that privacy is a fundamental human right. And as a fundamental human right, it needs to be protected on both sides of the Atlantic. We believe it can be advanced with more transparency. I speak and we speak as individuals and a company that is focused on the transparency of the issues around surveillance, as much or more so than any other company. I speak as the person who authorized the filing of litigation in 2013 against our own government, the United States government. We filed a lawsuit so we could be more transparent and share with people around the world the kind of national security orders and letters that we were receiving. We had to take a case to what's called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court in the United States. This is a court unlike any other in the United States. Most courts, they have a defined building, they have a public address, you know where to meet the people. This court has a phone number. And when you call the phone number, this is what you hear. Especially if the volume's up.
You have reached the United States Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Please leave a message.
As that indicates, this was a different kind of lawsuit than any that we had ever been involved in. In most cases, you write your brief, you file it, and then you wait to see what the other lawyers on the other side argue against you. Well, we filed our brief, and when the brief came back from the government, what we found was not what we normally get. It was rather difficult to know what the government was arguing against us. We persisted in court, but we didn't stop there. We took our message to the White House. And on the 17th of January, 2 years ago from yesterday, President Obama went to the Justice Department and he gave a speech that put the US government on the first steps towards more transparency and surveillance reform. Important steps that were taken in 2014 and then followed in 2015 when the US Congress passed legislation that the entire tech sector supported to eliminate bulk collection. But that having been said, these are important steps. I believe the president deserves credit for having taken them, but the work is not done. More transparency is needed. More transparency across the Atlantic is needed. And if a new safe harbor agreement provides the opportunity to provide assurances to people in Europe by advancing transparency across the Atlantic, that is a step that will benefit everyone, everywhere, especially if it's done as it can be in a thoughtful manner. But of course, that's not the only issue that people are having to grapple with. We appreciate there are important other issues. There's a question of jurisdiction. There's the question of how rights will be protected when data moves across the Atlantic. And here, we believe there are important goals that can and should be addressed and advanced. We need to start by recognizing, once again, that privacy is a fundamental human right and that rights need to have remedies. Europeans cannot lose their fundamental rights simply because someone else has decided to move their data. They deserve and need better than that. And yet at the same time, you will hear from those across the tech sector that privacy and data protection regulation needs to be clear, it needs to be coherent, it needs to be predictable. And we believe there are ways to move forward with respect to both of these goals together. But perhaps what is most important to keep in mind is that this issue really is too important to fail. It's about a fundamental right, it is about technology, but it's also about our economy as a whole. Last year, there was $240 billion of trade across the Atlantic in digital goods. Over the last 2 years, the last study that was done in 2013 showed that European multinationals had $2 trillion of sales in the United States. And studies have shown that US multinationals employ 3.8 million people in the European Union. So this is about privacy. It is about technology. It is about jobs. It is about trade. And it is about fundamentally growing the economy while balancing both privacy and safety. All of this needs to move forward. This cannot fail. But there are two other issues we need to think about before this year comes to an end. We also need a stronger rule of law across the Atlantic. This is another issue that we at Microsoft have been focused on. When you think about the issues around transatlantic data, it's worth reflecting on what is just common sense and obvious. There's less European data in the United States than there is in Europe itself. And yet right now, there is in court, based on what has happened in Ireland at our Dublin data center, this building, and the lawsuit we filed, an ongoing issue because it is the continuing position of the Justice Department of the United States that it does not need to wait for data to come to the United States in order to unilaterally obtain it. The US government continues to take the position that it can use its search warrants to force companies under its jurisdiction to go get European data and bring it to the United States without disclosing this to any European government or complying with any European law. And so when at a time when almost 100% of the world's attention is focused on what I'll call 10% of the issue, which is European data in the United States, it is important for all of us to stay focused on the other 90% and how European data will be protected in Europe itself from the extraterritorial reach unilaterally of US action. And this is an issue on which we at Microsoft do not stand alone. If you look at the amicus or friend of the court briefs that were filed even at the Intermediate Appellate Court in New York, you will find that there were briefs filed by 28 technology and media companies, by 23 trade associations and advocacy groups, by 35 of the leading computer scientists in the United States, and by the government of Ireland itself. This, too, is a defining privacy issue for 2016. And this, too, is just too important to fail. Finally, we need to think about one other thing that is being addressed and needs to continue to be addressed on both sides of the Atlantic and indeed around the world. And that is the need to modernize our laws so that we can protect privacy as it needs to be protected in the digital age. That's why we're enthusiastic about the action that was taken last year and will be pursued this year with the General Data Protection Regulation here in Europe. It's why we're enthusiastic about other measures such as the e-privacy directive and other aspects of the Digital Single Market Initiative. And it's why we're so focused on the need for similar action in the United States. The reality is on both continents and indeed more broadly around the world, we are trying to address the issues of the current day with laws that have become antiquated. Some things improve with age. Technology products and technology laws are seldom among them. 1986 was the year when the defining privacy law in the United States, the Electronic Communications and Privacy Act, was passed. By coincidence, it's the year that I started in a law firm where I was the first person in the 70-year history of this firm to say I would only accept the offer if I could get a personal computer on my desk. And I remember not only then using that computer, but using the laptop computer that was the cutting-edge device of the year 1986. I want to share that with you so you can see it today. You can see the laptop of 1986. First of all, it's hard to hold. It's pretty heavy. It had a screen. It wasn't even a graphical user interface. There was no mouse. And what was interesting is that the only storage device were these floppy diskettes. Now, if I compare that with the technology of today, the Microsoft Surface Pro 4, the storage capacity in the device in my left hand is equal to 355,000 of those diskettes. But the real point is this. This is the state of the art in technology. This represents the state of the art in technology law, especially in the United States. The law needs to catch up. And until the law catches up, we can't possibly give people around the world the confidence or the protection that they deserve. So as we look to the months and the year and even the years ahead, I would say this: we will all need to be persistent. As we persist, as we make our way through these negotiations and others, We need to think about technology, but we need to ground ourselves in the values that really are timeless. We need to constantly stay focused on the fundamental rights of people, including the right to privacy. We will need new solutions and new laws. And at a time when also often people will remark about the different cultures across the Atlantic, the different ways that people think, and sometimes they do, I hope we will always remember one other thing as well. We all share a common heritage. Regardless of where in the European Union or North America we live, we can trace a lot of our values back to ancient Greece. There is a powerful heritage of Western civilization and Western thought. And even at a time when the world is so focused on economic power and military might, across the Atlantic, we have no authority that is more powerful than our moral authority. We have ahead of us the opportunity to build on a shared tradition and create new solutions that will work for technology, advance the economy, and protect people as they look to us and a future of technology. That is what we need to do. Thank you very much.